Hello and welcome to this demonstration of Tanzu on VxRail. My name is Stefan Matthias and I will guide you through this demo. Have fun. So this is a brand new VxRail cluster. I have just set it up and made like 1 or 2 changes. We'll see in a second. Very easy to set up. If you want to have a demo of setting up the VxRail, please go and find the interactive demo of VxRail where you simply click here and do the installation. This will walk you through an installation of the VxRail, which will bring you to the step where I am now. I will post this link into the chat so you can easily find it later. Looking back to our cluster, we can see we have 3 VxRail nodes here. Oh, that's the wrong one. We have 3 VxRail nodes here. They are not configured. Everything is in a standard manner. We do have a VxRail manager here. We do have an internal vCenter here. And we are using vSAN storage. This is why we'll have a VxRail vSAN data store. And those are the local SD cards to the server we won't use today. So everything we're going to do will run on this local data store. In addition, we do have a virtual distributed switch here with 3 networks we're going to use. First one is front end. For the front end networking we're going to use for the Tanzu deployment. Here's the workload network we're going to use. And in addition to this, we are going to use one management network. I have also created 2 content libraries in the sake of the time, which is basically one is the HA Proxy, the load balancer we are going to deploy in a second. And the second one is the VMware content library for Kubernetes. We are using upstream conformant versions of Kubernetes, so there's no dedicated version for VMware. Those are basically the open source ones out of the public sites you can download from there. Perfect, so this is the only preparation I did, creating the content libraries and creating the networks. Everything else is basically standard deployment as you would see in the walkthrough. If I'm now starting to deploy my HA Proxy, going to my HA Proxy and deploy this one to an app, give it a name, Proxy, use my data center for this one, put it on my cluster, and review some details around the deployment, accept the ULA. And in this case, I'm using front-end network. If you would go with default, you would only have workload and management network. But in this case, we have decided to give you a full tour, including the front-end network. It is just a more separated deployment. And I would advise you to use the front-end network to keep it simple. We are now choosing our VxRail vSAN data store with the default storage policy for the deployment. And as you can see, this is already pre-selected front-end for front-end, workload for workload network. And as already announced, I'm going to use my management network for my management. Continuing, I do fill some information for the OVA, my basic password for this. I accept root permission because we need to log in for a second to get a certificate. This is optional, we don't need this. Giving it a real name, Tanzu HA Proxy.vxrail.fra.local, which I already added to my DNS. Adding my DNS server in here as well. Adding a management IP address for my load balancer. Given it a gateway. As you can see, I'm using a site annotation here, /24 for 255, 255, 255.0. And adding a workload IP address now as well. I'm using this one, a dedicated network. So 10.1 is my dedicated network. I divided it in multiple /27 networks, but basically using only one IP range. My gateway for this is the .1. And for my front-end IP addresses, I'm using the same range .10, but in this time a different /27 network. My gateway is .33. So this is basically my management IP addresses for management, workload, and front-end. And now I'm adding a load balancer IP range, which lies inside of the front-end IP address range. I divided my /27 into two /28s. So I'm using the second half of my /27 as a /28. This should give me enough resources for my demo. I leave the port as standard. We'll need this later to put this in during the deployment. I'll use admin, and I'm using my password here again for the login. And this concludes my deployment of the HA Proxy. And while this is being deployed, we'll have a look at my cluster. You'll need to add, if you're using it in production, a supervisor license. So this is the Tanzu basic license I added here. But if you just want to evaluate it, you can also start with an eval license. So for the first test, eval is okay. For production, I would use a real license. My VM is deployed, so I'm starting this one up. Power on. And I'm opening up a putty to connect to it to get the cert out of it. 150, I'll give it a sec. I'm usually too fast in those demos, and this will end up in problems and errors. So I'll just wait a little bit longer this time and try it now. Perfect. Login as root. This is the one we just enabled. Making this a little bit larger for you guys so you can see it properly. My password, the one we set up earlier. And if you check if config, you can see that we have now front-end management and workload config. And you can even ping some of those load balancer addresses we added in there. So for example, 50, 51, or 52. So the load balancer basically is using those IP addresses. And for a later step, we do need the cert for this machine. So we are cutting it in here. And we are going to reuse this in a second. Perfect. Now preparation for the load balancer is done. And we are starting into the workload management deployment. This is basically deploying the control plane into the cluster using cluster API and services like this. We're getting started. You can also kind of get the checklist first if it's your first time to see what you basically need. There are also some information you could follow. Since I already read this, I can continue. Since I am using Tanzu Basic, there's no NSX configuration required, and I can continue with my normal VDS deployment, so my virtual distributed switch with my 3 networks. Click next here, choose my cluster, click next here. I'm going for a small control plane size. You could go any size you want, depending on your plans and your deployments. For me, it's just a demo environment, so I'm going to continue with small. Next step, I'm choosing the default policy of vSAN for my storage policy. Clicking next, now entering the information of my load balancer we just deployed. So Tanzu minus HA minus proxy, using the HA Proxy. This is vSphere 7 update 1. In vSphere 7 update 2, we can use it 2 types of proxies, but in this one, we can only use HA Proxy. Entering my IP address here, 150, also adding the port 5556. Remember, this is the port we kept standard inside of the deployment of the OBA. We're using admin here, and we're using my standard password. For IP ranges, we are now using the front-end IP address range we have been defining in the deployment of the OVA. This was the /28. Now I just added this in here as a range. And lastly, we are going to import the certificate of the load balancer. Oh, perfect. Close this one down as we don't need it anymore. Click next. Now we are entering 3 IP addresses for the control plane deployment. I'm starting with 51 and then 52, 53. And I'm using my normal subnet and my gateway, all the same. And I'm using my DNS server, same as I used for my deployment of the load balancer. And I'm using my search domain, which is, as you can see up here, VxRail.fra.local. Clicking next. I'm now looking into my workload network, keeping this as a standard, but you could change if you want. This is an internal IP address for Kubernetes services. I'm keeping it standard. And for this one, I'm using my DNS server again, adding a workload network, and using my workload port group for this as well, using the correct gateway. It's 10.1, and using my subnet 224, which basically is a /27. Yeah. Inside here, I'm also using an IP address range. This one is basically all IP addresses except the .4, since I used the .4 for the load balancer, but all the others are free from a Kubernetes deployment. Saving this, click next, adding the content library here. And this time, this is my Kubernetes VMware library I've prefetched. As you can see, it has some size. This is why I prefetched it and didn't just create it. We'll see in a second how easy it is to create it. But for now, we just click next. And as you can see, this would validate your settings a bit. So if there's anything wrong in here, it would be a basic validation. And if you click finish, it will start to configure and deploy the cluster. This can take up to 20 to 30 minutes, and you may see some failures popping up here. Warnings, confirmations are okay. Errors could be concerning, but give it some time. The deployment will be retried if it's not working. Only if it doesn't work after a long time, you may check it. Going back to the content libraries just for a second, clicking inside here. As you can see, I do have all my Kubernetes versions in here, and it's very easy to set up. You basically go to content libraries, click create, and give it a name. Everything needs a name. And then you basically subscribe to an online library. And this is the link you're going to use. You can either Google it, or I'm pretty sure Jeremy or Raj can put it into the chat as well. Canceling here, looking into our cluster. As you can see, my namespaces are starting to populate, so VMs are being created. Wonderful. And on my workload management, you can see this is still under configuration. Since this would take too long for a demo and would be quite boring to wait for this to being deployed, while VMware is doing the job here, which is again basically enabling the TKG services in the vSphere kernel, using cluster API and versions like this. I am jumping over to a demo similar to this I have already prepared for you. So pretty much the same basic setup. I do have my VDS here, my front end, my workload, my management. I do have a VxRail data store running here. And I do have my Tanzu HA Proxy up and running too for my second. And as you can see, my supervisor control planes VMs are already running and are fully configured. Going inside here, you can see that my cluster in this scenario is up and running. So everything is fine and we can continue. So basically the deployment of Kubernetes is now done, and as a developer, we could start working. But the first thing I would need as a developer is a namespace. So as the VMware admin, I'm now creating a new namespace for my developers inside of my cluster, giving it a name, namespace 1, using my network I defined during the creation of workload. Click create, and now my namespace is created. We'll see this in a second in the cluster view as well. But as you can see, is my config is running, Kubernetes is active, my location is my cluster. I do have a permissions tab here where I can add users into. I can either use a normal AD or IPAM integration. In my case, since it's a simple demo, I'm just using a normal vSphere local account, and I've created a user for this with basically no roles. So this is a simple user with no roles. I'll show you in a second. Added this one to here, and also adding my vSAN default storage policy as a storage. So this namespace is now set up, and we can start using it. This will reload in a second, and as you can see here, my storage policy is there. Talking about the user, going into administration, going into the users, and you can see here in vSphere local, I just simply created a new user. There's no role allocated, and it's a simple user just created in a second. Going back to my hosts and clusters, you can now see I have my namespace, but it's pretty empty. So my job as a VMware admin is now done, and I can hand over this namespace to the developer. The developer can then see and open this here. This is your kind of example if your load balancer works, because this is inside of my load balancer network. It does give me a wonderful page back, so my developer can work with this one now. So my developer needs a machine. Since everything is virtual, I created a Ubuntu VM for him, which is pretty much basic. I did only give it an IP address for him to connect to it. And once this is started up, the developer, which is also myself, can start to deploy his own or his first cluster. Yet again, I'm waiting a second. Trying to connect to the Ubuntu now. Perfect. So now I am in the shoes of a developer, no administrator for VMware anymore. I can be both if I want, but in this case, I'm now a developer. Logging in with my user, logging in with my password. Perfect. First thing we need to do is basically install the Kubernetes CLI called Kubectl, and I can basically get it from here. So you can download it for Windows or download it for Linux. As I'm using a Linux, I will basically download it for Linux, and I'm saving the link, copy link address, going back to my Tanzu and basically doing a vget to the IP address, adding no check for certifications because I don't have anyone in my environment, downloading the vSphere plugin zip, need to unzip it. Perfect. As you can see, I do now have a bin folder in my folder and need to copy this one to my actual bin of the system. Wonderful. Secondly, I am also downloading a small Git repository of a colleague of mine called Chris Applegate. We can share the link in the chat as well. He basically created some small YAML files and some small scripts for you to basically first start with your deployment. And the only thing I'm doing here now is basically doing a Git clone to this repository. And we're going to use this to create a cluster in a second. You don't have to do this. This is just for me because I'm lazy. And I can use his prepared tools. So as you can see here now, I do have all of the scripts, and we are going to use the TKG guest and the Yelp YAML out of this. Perfect. But first, I'm logging into my namespace. First, I'm logging in as an administrator. This is not the user, just for test and to showcase something to you. Logged in now, I'm in my namespace. And if I would do kubectl get nodes here, I would basically see my 3 control plane nodes. Like you can remember ED252. Go back to here, look at one of those, and here we go. My DNS name ED252. You can see the 3 control planes we do have here are basically listed in here as well. But since we don't want to be an administrator in this case, I'm logging out again, and I'm logging in as my Tanzu user. And since my Tanzu user has access to the namespace, but he doesn't have access to the whole environment, he could basically not get the supervisor control plane. Like this is forbidden for him because he's only free for the namespace, and the supervisor control plane is outside of his span of control. Okay, but we will create his own cluster now. So this is all perfect. For this, we are creating a new YAML. We call it prod YAML from our TKG guest YAML. We are going inside of this prod YAML. And as you can see, this is basically the simplest cluster creation you can use. You can basically download this from VMware directly as an example YAML, like Chris did, or you can download it from Chris directly. Calling my cluster prod for production and using my namespace 1. In addition, I am changing my Kubernetes version to 18. I could use whatever version I wanted to use, as long as I have it in my repo. And in this case, I'm using 1 control plane and 3 worker nodes. Control plane is in a small size. The workers are an extra large size. You can change that depending on your needs. And as a storage, I'm using my vSAN default storage policy, as you can see here. Perfect. This is done. As you can see, my changes. Cut. My changes are here, and this is what we're going to deploy. So next, we are going to kubectl create -f prod YAML. So we are telling Kubernetes to basically create the prod YAML we just created. And while this is being created, we can switch back to the vCenter for a second, and we see a cluster popping up here. Still empty, but as you can see here in the tasks, control plane is starting up, getting the templates out of my VMware Kubernetes content library, and transferring the files, deploying it. As you can see, control plane is up and running. Perfect, wonderful. Powering it on. As soon as it's powered on, we're going to connect to the cluster. And then we'll see that 3 workers are popping up as well. So switching back to the developer, we can now connect to the namespace 1, but also the production cluster. We are now logged in. So let's see if we can get our nodes here. They are still starting up. So this can take a second. Okay, not there yet. As we see here, there's only the control plane. The worker nodes are about to come in a second. Let's just wait a couple seconds. I'm usually too fast. Wonderful. The first one is there, the master. And while we're waiting, the other ones will pop up. Next thing we're going to do is basically create an app. It's the Yelp app, running multiple containers and a front-end web page. So let's have a look into this. As you can see, there are multiple application and databases and app servers are being created. And for this one, we would need to set some permissions inside of this cluster. Let's first see if our nodes are finally there. Perfect. They're not ready yet, but as you can see, all three of them are back. And here, let's just verify J92HP. And we can see this one, J92HP here as well. So this is our cluster nodes. They are running and they will be available in a second. For our application, we are setting the permissions. Perfect. And now we are creating the Kubectl again. Create yelp. And we are seeing that like multiple containers are being created. And if we now do a kubectl get all, we can also see that those containers are being created now. This will again take a couple seconds. And we can also see that there is an Yelp UI. And the Yelp UI is using an external IP address out of my load balancers range, which we are going to connect to see the web page. It is loading up already, but there's still an app server missing. So we need to wait another second. Let's check here again. Still is the load one still created. One is missing. It's one of the app servers. Let's do it again. Perfect. Now they are all running, and we should see if we reload. We are finally seeing an app server using this web page, and we can now start to vote on our foot. If we are reloading, we are also seeing that the app server is changing. So this one is L4 ZQN, same one, NX896. So it's load balancing, and as you can see, the data is persistent. So we can continue voting, and until we delete the application, the data is very persistent, and also counting up my web views here. Perfect. So our application is working. Wonderful. So as a final step, we are going to scale my production cluster. So going back to the developer console, we are looking into our contexts. And as you can see, we have prod and NS1. We are currently in prod. Since we want to modify the prod cluster, we are going to change the context to NS1. So namespace 1. Now we are in the namespace 1, and we can now edit our cluster. And this is as easy as modifying a text file. We go down, and we could actually modify a lot of stuff in here, but for our test, we are only modifying our number of control planes workers from 1 to 2 and from 3 to 6. Committing the change. Oh, sorry. My bad. Of course, it has to be side of the range. So let's go back and change this to 3 and 6. I should follow the rules. Now it's edited. And if we switch back to the vCenter, we can see if we refresh that more workers and more control planes are being created quite fast. And if we go back to the production context, so now we're going back to our cluster, we can then also have a look at our nodes again. And this is still the 1+3, but we'll see that in a second the new ones will pop up here. Already being created. 2 of them are already running. 3 of them, still 2 of them running. And they should pop up here in a second. So it's very easy to scale a cluster. As I just demonstrated, it's as simply as I'm changing a text file, which is quite cool and very easy to do. Still taking a while. Switching back here, you can see all of them are powered up now. They are being joined to the cluster. So we should see them in a second. Perfect. First ones are popping up, getting ready. And if we would wait for longer, we would end up with 3 control planes and 3 more workers ready to scale productions. And this was my demo of Tanzu on VxRail. Hope you enjoyed it. Stay healthy and goodbye.